Science is a way of thinking, much more than it is a body of knowledge. And knowing is not enough. We must apply. Willing is not enough. We must do.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. I'm your host.
And I'm here as your expert guide.
In this series, we take the source material you send our way, articles, reports, you name it, and we really dig in.
Yeah, pulling out the key points, the insights, trying to make sense of it all.
Exactly. It's kind of your shortcut to getting up to speed on important current affairs. And this is actually the third topic in our daily series. It's designed especially for those of you prepping for exams, maybe like UPSC, but honestly, it's for anyone who wants a clear, critical look at the news based, directly on the sources. So today, we're diving into an article published by AFP. And what's interesting here is that it brings together two seemingly quite different things about China right now.
Right.
One is about recent military movements near Japan, and the other is about its current economic situation back home. That's the plan. We'll break down what this AFP source reports, the key facts and insights from both parts. We want to help you understand the significance as it's presented and maybe see how these different pieces fit together, or perhaps don't, when looking at a major global player like China.
Okay, sounds good. Let's start with that first part from the AFP article then, the military movements near Japan. The report details a pretty specific event.
Yes, involving a Chinese aircraft carrier group. Happened recently.
And the source identifies the ships.
It does. It says it was the Liaoning Carrier, accompanied by 2 missile destroyers and also 1 fast combat supply ship, a standard sort of carrier group.
And they entered Japan's exclusive economic zone, the EEZ. Yeah. The article gives specifics on where and when.
Yeah, it pinpoints the location and timing. Sailed Saturday, about 300 kilometers, that's roughly 190 miles southwest of Minabatori, which is Japan's easternmost island. And then they exited the EEZ on Sunday. So a relatively brief passage through that specific area.
Okay, but the report highlights something significant about this particular entry, right? Something about the location.
Exactly. According to a Japanese Defense Ministry spokesman, quoted by AFP, this was apparently the first time a Chinese aircraft carrier had entered this specific part of Japan's EEZ.
Interesting. So it's not just entering the EEZ, which, happens, but this specific location is what caught their attention, according to the source. Does the AFP report give any sense from the Japanese side about why they think China did this?
It does touch on that. The Japanese Defense Ministry's view, as reported by AFP, is that China is likely trying to improve its operational capability and also its ability to conduct operations in more distant waters, basically expanding their naval skills and reach.
Right, and that kind of fits into the broader picture the report mentions about China's growing military strength and how it uses its Navy and Air Force.
Precisely. The source notes China uses these assets to press disputed territorial claims, and that, understandably, rattles the U.S. and its allies in the Indo-Pacific region. These actions are often viewed through that lens.
So, given this specific incident, how did Japan respond this time, according to the AFP report?
Well, Japan's Chief Cabinet Secretary, Yoshimasa Hayashi, he stated on Monday, according to the article, that the government conveyed an appropriate message to the Chinese side, end quote. But, and this is noted in the report, he didn't actually confirm if a formal protest was lodged.
Okay, appropriate message, but maybe not a formal protest. That's interesting, especially when you compare it to past events mentioned in the source. The report also mentions what the carrier group did after leaving the EEZ on Sunday.
Yes, it notes that fighter jets and helicopters were seen conducting takeoffs and landings from the carrier after it had exited the zone. Standard operational drills, presumably.
And Japan was keeping an eye on things.
Oh, definitely. The article says Japan deployed its warship, the Haguro, to the area to monitor the situation while the Chinese group was nearby.
Now, you mentioned this might be the first time in that specific EEZ location, but the Liaoning has been active near Japan before, right? The source brings up other instances.
It does. AFP recalls a couple of recent ones. Just last month, for instance, the Liaoning sailed between 2 southern Japanese islands. That was also within Japan's EEZ. It was moving from the East China Sea into the Pacific, and again, the report mentions it conducted flight operations then too.
And there was another one mentioned going back a bit further.
Yes, September last year. The carrier sailed between 2 Japanese islands near Taiwan, and that time, it actually entered Japan's contiguous waters, which is closer than the EEZ within 24 nautical miles.
Ah, okay. And how did Japan react back then in September?
Well, the source reminds us that Tokyo's reaction was stronger. At that time, Japan called the move unacceptable and expressed serious concerns directly to Beijing. So comparing that stronger language to the more recent appropriate message without confirming a protest, well, it might suggest a shift or at least a different characterization this time based on this AFT report.
Okay. And just for clarity, the article explains the EEZ concept.
Briefly, yes. It reminds readers that under international law, an EEZ gives a coastal state special rights over marine resources, things like fishing and mining, out to 200 nautical miles, or about 370 kilometers from its coast.
Got it.
And just one more related point from the report on recent maritime activity.
Yeah.
Late last month, Japan also accused Beijing of doing some unnotified maritime scientific research within its EEZ. This was near the Okinotori Atoll. So the ASP article highlights, a range of recent Chinese activities reported in Japan's economic waters.
Okay, that wraps up the first main theme from the AFP article, the reports on China's military movements near Japan. Now, the source pivots. It uses that meanwhile transition, signaling a shift to a different, though maybe related topic, China's domestic economic situation.
Right, a different set of challenges presented in the same report.
And this side of the picture, while it looks quite challenging according to the data presented, the article highlights recent figures on consumer prices, the CPI.
Yes, the Consumer Price Index. This data, from China's National Bureau of Statistics, the NBS, and reported by AFP, shows consumer prices actually fell for the fourth month in a row in May.
4 straight months of falling prices. Wow. The report says it was down 0.1% compared to last year.
That's right, which was unchanged from April's figure, but maybe slightly better than the -0.2% that a Bloomberg survey, mentioned in the article, had forecast. Still, it's deflation.
And deflation is bad. Why is that a threat?
Well, the source explains it quite clearly. When people expect prices to keep falling, what do? They tend to put off buying things, wait for a better deal later.
Right. Why buy that sofa today if it might be cheaper next month? Makes sense.
Exactly. And that lack of demand, well, it ripples through the economy. The AFT report outlines these downstream effects. If people aren't buying, companies might have to cut production, they might freeze hiring, maybe even lay people off, and they might be forced to discount their existing stock just to move it, which really hurts their profits, even if their own costs stay the same.
Yeah. The report actually quotes an expert on this.
It does. Ziwei Xing from Pinpoint Asset Management. He's quoted saying pretty bluntly that China continues to face persistent deflationary pressure. And crucially, he adds that Beijing needs to rely on domestic demand to fight the deflation, emphasizing that internal boost is needed.
And it's not just consumer prices, is it? The report mentions factory gate prices, too, the Producer Price Index, or PPI.
Yes, and that's also been weak. The AFP article points out that the PPI, according to the NBS data, has been dropping for over 2 years now, a long slump.
And the May figures?
They were particularly concerning, according to the way the report frames it. The PPI fell 3.3% in May compared to last year. That drop actually accelerated from the 2.7% fall in April, and it was worse than the 3.2% decline analysts in that Bloomberg survey had expected.
So the report connects these economic struggles and the deflation, weak producer prices to a couple of main things.
Yeah, it points to that sluggish domestic spending we just talked about, but also mentions global trade turmoil as a factor. It suggests Beijing is really struggling to boost consumption effectively. And these economic headwinds, well, they threaten China's official growth targets. Plus, the report notes, it makes it harder for China to shield its economy from the impact of U.S. tariffs, what the source calls President Trump's tariff blitz.
Okay, but what about exports? Are they helping at all?
Interestingly, yes, for now. The report mentions that exports have actually been holding up relatively well, providing some support. However, that same economist, Ziwei Zhang, is quoted again with a warning. He says exports will probably slow as the front-loading feeds out.
Front-loading? What's that mean?
He clarifies it refers to overseas buyers basically stocking up now, increasing their orders ahead of potential future tariff hikes.
Wow.
So buying more now just in case it gets more expensive later.
Ah, I see. So it might be a temporary boost that could disappear. The report also mentions we'll get more trade data soon.
That's right. Official trade figures for last month are due out shortly, which everyone will be watching closely.
And speaking of trade, the AFP article flags upcoming talks.
Yes, really important ones. It highlights that U.S. and Chinese officials are expected to meet on Monday in London for what the report calls high-stakes trade talks.
High stakes indeed. Is this the first time they're talking since the latest tariffs?
No, this is actually the second round of formal negotiations since the U.S. administration launched what the report terms its global trade blitz back in April. The first round was in Geneva in mid-May. That led to a pause on some tariffs, but they didn't reach a full deal. So hopes are pinned on London.
And who's expected at these London talks, according to the source?
From China, Vice Premier He Lifeng, and from the U.S. side, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, top-level officials.
And the backdrop for these talks?
The report notes they were announced after a phone call last week between President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping. President Trump apparently described that call as very good. So, despite all the economic friction and the military posturing we discussed earlier, the diplomatic channels seem to remain open, at least based on this report.
Right. So there we have it, a deep dive into this one AFP article, which covered quite a bit of ground. We looked at the report on the recent Chinese naval activity near Japan, that specific EEZ entry being key, and then we shifted to the internal picture. China's economy, the deflation issues, the PPI drop, and the context of those looming trade talks.
And all of that detail comes straight from the AFP source material you provided. It paints a picture, doesn't it? A nation navigating complex external relations, projecting military power, as reported by Japan, while at the same time grappling with some really significant domestic economic headwinds, like this persistent deflation and the whole global trade situation.
Definitely a complex picture.
Which brings us to maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. Drawing from these themes in the source, how might these seemingly separate threads, the military activity near Japan and the economic struggles at home, potentially interact, if at all? Does, say, economic pressure maybe incentivize external actions, or are they completely separate tracks for Beijing? Trying to understand a major global power like China really forces you to look at all these different pieces, the military reports, the economic data, the diplomatic moves, and consider the incredibly complex forces that might be shaping their decisions. It's rarely straightforward.
That's a great point. And understanding these interconnected global events, or at least how they're reported, is so crucial for staying informed, especially if you're tackling current affairs for something like UPSC prep, or frankly, if you just want to be a well-informed citizen.
Yeah.
Critically looking at sources like this AFP article is key.
Absolutely.
So if you found this deep dive helpful in breaking down the source material and sparking some thought, please do take a second to like this video or audio and subscribe to our series.
Yeah, your engagement really helps us know what's useful for you and lets us keep bringing you these analyses.
And please leave a comment below. Any further questions this raised, or maybe other topics, other sources you've come across that you'd like us to dive into. Your input is genuinely valuable. It helps us tailor these discussions for you.
We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive.
We'll see you next time.